Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining SAR for today's event. My name is Paul Ryer. I'm the Director of Scholar Programs here at the School for Advanced Research in Santa Fe, New Mexico, and I am absolutely delighted to welcome you to today's discussion of Beautiful Mystery, Living in a Wordless World by anthropologist Danilyn Rutherford. Before I introduce today's participants, a couple of announcements and housekeeping things. Firstly, thank you to our sponsors for today's event, um, the Patricia G. Foshi Charitable Fund, Andrea Fisher Fine Pottery, Thornburg Investment Management, Dan Marians, UBS Financial Services, Santa Fe Dining, and Shiprock Santa Fe, and the Wintergrand Foundation for Anthropological Research. We have a couple of forthcoming events. This is the first of 2026, but we have a scholar colloquium tomorrow. Angela Parker, one of our resident fellows, our Lamont Fellow, will be presenting about her research. That is the in-person seating is full, but it will be available online, and I believe you'll have a link here put up in a moment to actually attend remotely for that. And then next Tuesday, January 20th, Steve Houston will be giving a virtual talk as well, making sound among the ancestral Maya. So again, you'll see a link for that um, in the chat field. If you have if you have questions, comments, and you'd like a question answered at the end of the event today, please put your question into the Q&A field below at the bottom of your screen, and we will get to as many of those questions as we can. I will come back towards the end of the event to help read out those questions. So please, as you're listening along, please don't hesitate to put a question into the Q&A field. As I mentioned, today's event is a discussion of Danilyn Rutherford's new book, Beautiful Mystery. I will be joined by Danilyn Rutherford and two panelists who will have a conversation about the book. And then again, they'll talk for about 45 minutes, and then we will shift to Q&A. We have a hard stop, unfortunately, after an hour. So without further ado, Danilyn Rutherford is the president of the Wintergrand Foundation, and she's also an extraordinarily accomplished anthropologist. I won't be able to do justice to her CV, but she was formerly a professor and chair of the anthropology department at the University of California, Santa Cruz. Before that, she was a professor at the University of Chicago Department of Anthropology. She did her doctorate at Cornell University, her master's also at Cornell, and bachelor's at Stanford. She's the author of 4 books, including the new book we're going to be hearing about today, Beautiful Mystery, Living in a Wordless World, Duke University Press. Also, Living in the Stone Age, Reflections on the Origins of a Colonial Fantasy, Chicago, 2018. Laughing at Leviathan, Sovereignty and Audience in West Papua, University of Chicago Press 2012, and Raiding the Land of the Foreigners, The Limits of the Nation on an Indonesian Frontier, Princeton University Press 2003. Welcome, Danilyn.
Thanks.
But before I let you talk, if I could also introduce the two people who are joining us to discuss the book. Dr. Ashanté Reese is a writer, anthropologist, and associate professor of African and African diaspora at the University of Texas, Austin. Dr. Reese has 3 books. Her first book, Black Food Geographies, Race, Food Access, and Self-Reliance in Washington, D.C., published by UNC Press in 2019. Black Food Matters, Racial Justice in the Wake of Food Justice, co-edited with Hannah Garth, University of Minnesota Press 2020, and just forthcoming, and I've just learned of this, Ashanté, this is terrific. I get to be one of the first people to talk about your forthcoming book, Gather, Black Food Nourishment and the Art of Togetherness, W. W. Norton, forthcoming in April of this year. Congratulations. Also joining us will be Anand Pandian, the Krieger-Eisenhower Professor of Anthropology. I hope I pronounced Krieger right, Krieger, at Johns Hopkins University with a joint appointment in Earth and Planetary Sciences. His books include A Possible Anthropology, Methods for Uneasy Times, and Something Between Us, the Everyday Walls of American Life and How to Take Them Down, which maybe some of our audience has heard us discuss here in this series. Also available from Stanford University Press. Thank you all for joining us. I'm going to step back and let the three of you talk about the book. Perhaps, Danilyn, you want to start with a little bit of description of the project and of the book, and then the three of you have a discussion. I'll be back at about 11:45 to help answer the questions from the audience. So can't wait. Thank you very much. See you then.
Yeah. Thanks so much. I mean, this is such an honor to be doing this. I'm really grateful to everyone at SAR and to Anand and Ashanté for being willing to be here with me today. It's such an honor to share the stage with you both. We talked about Anand's book in September, also sponsored by SAR, and it's really great to have a chance to do this again. Ashanté, you're next. My stepdaughter, Sophia Lombrelia, has this theory of the dessert stomach. Your dinner stomach may be full, but your dessert stomach always has room. As anthropologists, I think we have anthropology stomachs. These stomachs keep digesting 24/7, whether we like it or not. So even though my daughter's early years were tumultuous, they were also instructive. This book is an attempt to put my methodological cards on the table to show how anthropology and life infiltrate each other, how life conditions thought and thought shapes life. Its initial ingredients were two sets of text, academic papers that my daughter kept sneaking into, and some memoiristic writing I was doing just for fun. It was hard to turn all this into a book, and I can talk about how hard in our conversation. But for now, I want to give you a taste of the book by reading from it. So this is the prologue. If you look at the right time, you can see them, improbable flashes of neon green flitting from tree to tree. Craig discovered them as soon as we moved in, less than a month after our daughter, Millie, was born. Feral parakeets. I was in Millie's room assembling the changing table when Craig called me up to our roof deck to look. Right there. I squinted at the patch of sky between two trees. The swarm of dots looked black until the flock wheeled and the green feathers caught the sun. We have to show Ralph. Later that day, while Millie was napping, the three of us climbed up to look. Perched in his father's arms, Ralph stabbed his chubby finger at the horizon. Some say they're descended from escaped pets that somehow found each other, these monk parakeets that live in the treetops. Others say a flock was released when a deal in the exotic animal trade went bad. Chicago isn't the most welcoming environment for these tropical exiles, but they've made it their home, breeding in the wild here for nearly 40 years. That fall, the birds were bright against the sky. I watch for them with each changing season. In July, when the trees explode with new growth, you're less likely to see them than to hear them. A lone screech pierces the morning birdsong. Trills, cackles, and squawks mark sundown. In the winter, you'll see their dwellings, bundles of brown leaves suspended where the bare branches reach for the sky. Nestled beak to tail feathers, that's how I always pictured them, warming each other and waiting for spring. After Craig died, I was the one who took Ralph to the roof deck. Every April, we scanned the treetops and listened for their voices. In January and February, we surveyed the nests for signs of life. At the beginning of the summer, my mother drove down from Wisconsin with lots of marigolds and morning glories, and she squeezed in next to us and searched the sky. Did I ever take Millie to see the parakeets? Probably not. On that first day, she was a newborn, a soft little ball curled up in her crib. By the end of our time in Chicago, she was almost too heavy to carry up the stairs. But even then, she still couldn't follow my gaze. She wouldn't have known what I was looking at. I was a widow by the time Millie got her first wheelchair. I was also a newly tenured professor. My daughter, who is now an adult, does not walk on her own or speak or communicate with signs or symbols. Millie was 3 and her brother was 6 when her father died suddenly of a heart attack. I was 2 weeks away from learning whether my promotion had gone through. When the monk parakeets soared among the treetops, I longed for Millie to see them. I wanted her to experience this flash of wonder. Her disability felt tragic. I mourned all the things we might never share. Now I wonder whether I had it backward. Maybe Millie was the flash of wonder, and I was the one who couldn't see. Across the gulf between our species, I watched the monk parakeets and pondered the mystery of their existence. My own daughter has proven as fascinating to me, as much a stranger to the landscapes I used to take for granted. Millie has brought me into a world that stretches much further than the one I once thought of as my own. A month after Craig died, Ralph joined a support group at his elementary school for bereaved children. At the end of a session, the school psychologist pulled me aside. My son didn't seem to care about homework and grades. She was worried. Ralph is floating above his life. Her words stung, and I thought of my own life and Millie's. How far above the life of a typical mother or professor was I floating? How far was Millie floating above the lives of most toddlers her age? But was this really such a bad thing? This isn't a story about learning to fit in. It's a story about learning to fly. And in the end, we had company up there in the air. So,
All right. Thank you. Thank you for reading. I've already shared this privately. I think this is just a beautiful book for all the people who are in the audience. I don't even think you need to hear anything we have to say. Just I want the only if you don't hear anything else, just go buy the book if you don't have it yet. But Danilyn, when I was reading, I found myself writing these little notes to you. So I'm just gonna share 3 of them. Dear Danilyn, I call this one part 1. I am beginning your book, and I've just put it down, not even 2 pages into the introduction. The story of Sarah McSweeney that begins it feels unbearable. And then, even after that stop, I stopped again, reading where you begin to discuss inhabitable worlds. That stroke of optimism, of world building, has undone me, as I'm reading during a time where it seems people with a lot of power are doing all they can to make the world increasingly more uninhabitable. I want to be where inhabitability is the norm, where that's the goal. When I pick up your book again, I look forward to being with Millie. Part 2. There is a line where you say, quote, you don't have to be the same to be close. And another where you write, quote, unconditional love means not needing to know. The former line makes me think about how so many of the ideological, political, and physical battles that are fought are antithetical to that simple, profound proclamation that you share. So many power struggles are built around wrestling difference into submission, about creating conditions where sameness is synonymous with thriving. And why? Perhaps because of your second sentiment. To live with difference means to live with the fact that many of us, most of us, struggle with loving unconditionally, if for no other reason than to do so means submitting to mysteries that we have no right to understanding. This makes me wonder about my own relationship to unconditional love. Me, an academic, an anthropologist, a person whose very job includes knowing or discovering what others may not know. Reading these 2 sentences make me rethink what it means to do what we do. It makes me rethink how I want to be in the world more than what it means to do this work. Part 3. Danilyn, it's weird to say this, but I love Millie so much after reading. I love the details about her laughs and perceived humor, her mannerisms, and how the world responds to her. This book is about Millie, but also it is.
oops.
But Millie's life is a portal into so many questions about and experiences of humanness. What does it mean to have had dreams of a life that will never materialize in the way that it was dreamt? What does it mean to give care without the expectation that it will be reciprocated? What does it mean to release the tyranny of believing that verbal communication is the only or the most supreme way of being in this world? You write, quote, justice requires respect for cognitive mystery. I love that line. I love it because it makes me think about other words and phrases that cognitive mystery stand in for. Words like trust, humility, believing in the unknown. When I think of your words, I think of a justice that does not require proof. It doesn't require poking or prodding or striving. It simply requires embracing mystery. It reminds me of Catherine McKittrick's words, they cannot have or know everything. And then it makes me think of what Millie teaches us, that without mystery, we turn everyone and everything into a solvable research project. And in our efforts to erase difference, we erase humanness itself.
Wow. Those are such beautiful notes. I have no words to respond to them. But I guess one thing I'll say is I think, it's so funny because I started thinking about writing about Millie like when she was tiny, and it was kind of like what to expect when you're expecting, those books that you get if you're a parent, right? And you need instructions, which I definitely did, and I'm like, okay, I'm going to write a book called What Not to Expect. But there's a sense in which I feel like I couldn't have written this book unless I had been writing it now. And, just talking, hearing from you is making me think about my work at Wintergren, which is quite bureaucratic in many ways. It's a service job. I spent a lot of time going through reviews, right? Looking at what people write about work that I don't necessarily understand, and sort of what does it mean to kind of serve a discipline and the people affected by this discipline in this moment, right? What does it mean to extend generosity to projects that are not your own, right? Another part of it is just the privilege of just the projects I've gotten to know, which are kind of like beyond the little, like, realm in which I was trained, which was very much Southeast Asian studies, Indonesia. I became an anthropologist because I lived in Indonesia. I love living in Indonesia. I wanted to go back and live among people. And I had, whatever, some political instincts about our country's impact on this country, right? And it was actually quite narrow. And becoming part of Wennergren, is really expanded my views. So one of the things that happened during the period I was writing this is the project that Kamari Clark and Deb Thomas and later Kelly Gillespie launched around radical humanism. And, I had the privilege to be part of those conversations in Cape Town and just really thinking about what Deb and Kamari meant about giving up on the idea of transparency. Like, how do you study? I mean, I think that it's right to want to promote understanding that other lives are possible. How do you do that without insisting on the kind of transparency that's almost like an effect of the way ethnographies are written? It's written from a position of authority. So it's sort of like this project with my daughter, in a sense, the experiences with Millie kind of needed to come together with these things that were going on for me in my work life and my professional life, and these things I was learning from anthropologists who are grappling with these kinds of questions. So yeah, I really appreciate this. And I also think, whatever, I appreciate the fact that you feel this is about living and not just about doing research, which, you know, all our moments are moments of living, right? We define them as different things, but we're always engaged with one another in ways that should demand, care, basically, right? And I think if that's something that you got out of this book, I really appreciate that. Yeah. And I have a lot to say about the hellscape, but I'll leave it at that for now. Yeah.
Did you want to continue, Ashanté, or shall I jump in?
No, I'm really eager to hear what you have to say. Maybe we can all kind of chat together.
Yeah.
All right, sounds good. Yeah, no, the conversation has already just honestly been so humbling, and I honestly mostly feel like listening to both of you and thinking along with you, and also feeling the importance of what you're saying, because I think one of the most extraordinary things that comes out of this book is the realization that thinking and feeling may be interrelated, but they are different things. And there are other registers of our experience and our lives as individuals, but also as relational people that transcend this domain of thought and cognition. And it's really so remarkable the way that you bring that out, Danilyn. The book was really extraordinary to read. For me, it was an extraordinary experience to read it as another writer, as a fellow anthropologist, but honestly, also just as a parent. You know, I was reading from the book at the orthodontist's office this week, where I had to take my daughter to get her braces adjusted. And here I am sitting in the corner of the orthodontist's office, just tearing up, wondering who's going to notice and wondering whether it matters at all that they do, right? Because to be honest, there's so much more to our lives than what we show in our faces. And that's, again, one of the great lessons of the book. And so I just want to acknowledge, first of all, the honesty that you've written with, the just extraordinary spirit of vulnerability. The voice that the book is written in is so disarming, and there's clearly so much care in the book, and yet there's a kind of quietness with which that's conveyed that I think just makes it all the more powerful. And yeah, you are that warrior that you describe yourself as at one point. And I'm just grateful, honestly, to have been able to share some moments from that journey with you as a reader. So much of the book, as I think you've already been talking about, and I began to allude to earlier in what I began to say, has to do with the challenge of relating to others beyond this sphere of understanding that we take for granted as the core of our social relationships. You talk at the outset about the book bringing forward a side where co-presence matters more than convention, where we struggle to make ourselves felt instead of insisting on making ourselves understood. This is a tough task for academics like ourselves to take seriously, but you rightly remind us later on that this is a much broader and more significant challenge than we might care to admit. You say, we get Millie, which means we get what it takes to care deeply about someone we will never fully understand, someone like me or like you or like all the someones whose lives are entangled with ours, whether we are willing to acknowledge them or not. And the sphere of those others that we struggle to acknowledge or struggle not to acknowledge is quite vast. Ultimately, you're speaking of a really unique form of human experience, which is Millie's, but the kind of thinking that you're doing here obviously reminds us to think through the range of lives that we live in the company of, beginning with those parakeets whose co-presence you sketched so beautifully at the very outset in the prologue that you shared with us. One book that I was reminded of as I was reading Beautiful Mystery was this book by the naturalist Peter Godfrey Smith, which you may or may not be aware of, called Other Minds. And it's a book about octopus cognition and the challenge of approaching the cognitive difference of beings like cephalopods in a spirit of wonder, rather than with an instinct to sort of classify and categorize and domesticate, not to other the other, in other words, but actually ultimately to attune to the otherness within.
Yeah.
Godfrey Smith insists that our consciousness actually evolved in the ocean. And if we follow that line,
Yeah.
then we're forced to acknowledge a kind of fundamental alienness of our own minds to
Yeah.
ourselves, to others. And I feel that the challenge of bearing witness to that kind of alienness comes through in a really extraordinary way in what you've written. You said earlier that what you're wrestling with here is how life conditions thought and thought shapes life. And there's such a vivid reminder in the book of the full span of what is at stake in this word life,
Hmm.
in these lives that we share with other beings whose understanding or whose life we can only understand in such a limited way ultimately. But having said all of these things, I do have some questions that I also wanted to share, and maybe the first that I might ask as a question, in addition to whatever you might say in response to what I've shared so far, might simply be the beautiful mystery of how you could write a book like this in the first place. It had to be difficult. How'd
Yeah.
you do it?
Yeah. Well, I mean, first of all, I have to say something. I'm sorry you were crying in the orthodontics office. I have the privilege of being married to a wonderful fiction writer, Ralph Rumbrellia, who is super allergic to sentimentality. So I'm like, I failed clearly. But anyway, yeah, no, I
It's all
really,
good. It's all good. It's all
yeah, I
good.
appreciate your
It
kind
was
words.
cathartic.
Good, I'm glad. Yeah, it's really funny. It's part of the book. Like, Craig died, I mean, literally 2 weeks before I got tenure. And it's like, I was a very goal-driven kind of person. I had life mapped out. It's like suddenly, boom, that was blown up. And I had this kind of real feeling like you get up in the morning and you go and do stuff, and it better be worth doing. And it made me think about my job in a really different way. You know, um, because of Millie, my dream of being an anthropologist, which was like go back and live for 5 years in Indonesia at some point, that wasn't going to happen. And all of the stuff we complain about service, teaching, that actually became really important. My relationships with graduate students became really important. And I also like kind of just developed this sensitivity. It is kind of like two things happen when you get tenure. Either you get magisterial or you get perverse. And it's like, I'm just going to get perverse. you know, I'm going to just like do the kinds of things I want to do in the classroom. It's like I was teaching this big theory class. They're like, don't play games. Some of my students were like, no, we played lots of games, you know. So just that kind of freedom, I think, was part of this. Also, coming to UC Santa Cruz, I just have to flag like this is a place that's incredibly capacious in terms of thinking about forms of writing and forms of thinking. But yeah, so there's all of that. I can tell a narrative about it. But the other thing that just happened is that when Millie was diagnosed, I already couldn't help talking about her in class. It's sort of like, given my own kind of training within anthropology, which was with the very brilliant Jim Siegel, these questions of language and what lies beyond language had kind of been part of my thinking for a while. So I'm like, teaching Hume or Hegel or whatever, and I'm like thinking about my daughter. So she already was sort of sneaking into my academic thinking, and then she started appearing in just some papers I was writing, right? So I had these kind of articles, chapters and books and so on. But then at the same time, I also had started doing just some writing practice with folks in Santa Cruz. I have a teacher, Laura Davis, and I've kind of been doing stuff with her since I moved here, first writing practice, which is basically you sit in a circle, you're given a prompt, you're given 10 minutes or 15 minutes. You write by hand. No one's pen is allowed to leave the paper. At the end of the 15 minutes, it's like time's up, and then you just go around and you read what you wrote. And the only thing anyone's allowed to say is thank you. So it's this really great way just to generate sort of material. Yeah, and then when I decided to try to turn this into a book, I moved into a feedback class where people are allowed to say a lot of things other than thank you. So that became quite different. But yeah, basically what I had was I had these chapters, I had memoiristic writing, and frankly, in my earlier books, I don't know, I'm kind of like sort of misbehaved as a scholar. It's like I would just have a bunch of articles and chapters and things. It's like, okay, glue them together and it's a book, Whereas I tried to do that with this book and that did not work at all. So there was a lot of wrestling with the structure. Was it going to be academic chapter, little snippet and back and forth? Um, uh, Here you go, sweetie. Yeah. Was it going to be, like just a chunk of academic writing and then the other stuff in the middle? I really wasn't sure what kind of book it was going to be. So I ended up having, a lot of help developing the structure and then just going back and rewriting all of the academic parts so that the voice was consistent throughout. And so, yeah, I've never worked as hard on a writing project as I did on this. But I'm really glad I
Yeah.
did. I am really glad I did.
Well, when I think about what you've just been saying in relation to the book that you've given all of us, one thing that really does come into focus for me is the way in which section by section, what you wind up doing with these three main sections that carry the narrative forward is taking us further and further into Millie's world
Mm,
and
mm,
giving us a more tangible, more and more tangible sense
hmm.
of what it means to live in that world
Yeah.
rather than a more familiar world and a more familiar set of coordinates that we might otherwise take for granted. And I think some of the most extraordinary lessons for me, especially as we get toward the end, have to do with the coordinates
Hmm.
of that world. And this moment in one of the last chapters, for example, when you're talking about Millie's disinterest in faces
Hmm.
and her interest much more in stringy things. It was so vivid and evocative just to sort of reimagine the world all over again as a
Hmm.
world composed of strings
Yeah.
rather than a world composed of faces.
Yeah.
And it's an exercise in a different kind of attentiveness that I think you lead us through. And one can evoke different lines of thinking around objects and things and so on and so forth. And of course, a lot of that's already it's braided in here, but there's also, I think, a certain ethos of receptivity and
Hmm.
of openness that you're exercising in what you
Hmm.
pay attention to or what you call us to pay attention
Hmm.
to. And I
Hmm.
wonder if you might talk about that a little. I think a lot of us might be interested in this challenge of seeing the world a little more expansively
Hmm.
with
Hmm.
a little more of that curiosity that you've mustered up so effectively,
Yeah.
such that we wind up seeing these things that we're not otherwise accustomed to seeing. How do we learn to pay attention in that more expansive way?
Yeah, thanks so much. I mean, the in terms of the arc of the book, I think you really kind of got it. It sort of starts very much, it's like about this little nuclear family, and then it sort of expands out. It's more peopled, which is one of the things that's most remarkable about Millie's world, is it's very peopled. No one spends as much time with other people as my daughter, right? But yeah, in terms of that sort of expansiveness. I mean, one of the things I wanted to capture was that for those of us who have a reason to really, become close, right, to someone like Millie, who want to become close, she exerts a force, right? Because you are rewarded when you figure out what it is she responds to, right? So it's like, I think a lot of us go through life just taking for granted all sorts of ableist assumptions around what an interaction is, you know, and if people don't kind of like respond the way you expect, there's a real tendency just to turn away. But, you know, people who are professional care providers, which are kind of the hero of this entire story, have a reason for wanting to connect. And it's like a drug. My daughter's smile and laugh is so great. And you kind of have to work for it. You know, she really sort of shapes the social world around her so that, like, you know, we're kind of invited to imagine in ways that we might not imagine. I mean, for her, the world is also populated with voices. You know, at one point in the book, I say for Millie, there's only now. It's not completely true. One of her favorite things is listening to my husband play a blues riff on his electric guitar, right? She just is totally attuned to that sort of beat, that kind of tiny moment of anticipation between a tick and a talk, right? You know, so it's sort of thinking about that as well. Yeah, I mean, basically, I don't know. I've recently, and this is not in the book at all, but I'm working on a project on proprioception with Julia Elyashar and going down all sorts of bizarre rabbit holes. But I've become really interested in ecological psychology, you know, which is very much kind of along the lines of what you're saying. It's like, you know, forms of being in this interconnected world. It's all about different modalities of responsiveness and different kinds of affordances and different kinds of worlds that are occupied, you know, and it's possible to feel the force of this other way of inhabiting the world in a way that kind of potentially brings you in and allows you to engage in that active imagination. So yeah, I loved where you were starting with, you know, the octopuses and everything, which is also, you know, a book that, you know, is here in our household. My husband's really into it. I've not read it yet, but I will. But yeah, I'm not sure if that answers your question, but definitely, you know, again, I just want to say care workers are incredibly poorly paid. You know, they're incredibly vulnerable in this moment for all kinds of reasons. You know, something people don't realize is that, you know, Medicaid doesn't just pay for the health care of people like my daughter and the services that allow them to live in the community. For a lot of really low paid people who do this incredibly important care work, it's also supporting their health care as well, you know. So yeah, it's just a really serious situation, but people need to recognize that this is highly skilled, incredibly creative labor, right? That's like thoroughly under-recognized and devalued in all kinds of ways. So that's sort of part of what I wanted to bring to light too, is, you know, care work is really, you know, it's an exercise of the ethical imagination. It's also, I just think, an exercise of the imagination. It's a source of new forms of thinking, and I don't think we appreciate that enough.
Can I just I think this line that you're thinking about, along with Anand's question around just like, how do you train yourself to pay attention in a different way? When I was reading it, two things come to, I teach a class called Embodied Ethnography. And part of the goal of the class that I am not sure that I've reached yet is to
Mm,
try to think around the question of what happens when we fully submit to the process of ethnography so much that we expect to be changed in the process.
yeah.
And when I was reading your book, I was like, "Oh my God, this is the book I need for the class." Because on one level, the paying attention to the details is classic ethnography. But
Hmm.
I think the part that your book does that I don't think we often see as a requirement of ethnography is the assumption that we will be changed in the process.
Yeah.
That this isn't just a process of knowledge generation, right? It is also a process in some ways undoing and self-creation. And
Mm,
so I thought about your attention to detail, yes, as an ethnographer, but also as someone who is kind of there's one line, I can't remember, I'm gonna butcher it, where you basically say something along the lines of everyone makes their life fit in some way. And
yeah.
I that really stuck out to me because I think in the process of exploring this beautiful mystery, you submit to it.
Hmm.
And it's
Hmm.
just kind of like, not
Yeah.
only are there things that I cannot know, there are ways that I cannot be anymore
Yeah.
because of what I do not know. And I
Yeah.
think that's just like such a beautiful, I don't even, I will ask you if part of your goal was to kind of upend what we think of ethnography, but that is part of what I took from the book too, which is like really rethinking what
Yeah.
I think the goal of doing ethnography is.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. No, that's completely true. I mean, I think there's, yeah, I have lots to say about that. It's like Millie's downstairs. I think she's downstairs right now. She's so busy. She may be out riding horses or something. I don't know. I was going to read the part of the book that describes Millie just so people have an image in their head. But basically, like I say, she's 5 foot tall, built kind of like me, has a smile. She kind of looks like Julia Roberts when she smiles. She has this great smile.
Mhm.
She's basically like, this kind of beautiful being. But yeah, I come downstairs and I say good morning to her. I was like, morning, Millie. And sometimes she's like, and sometimes she's like smiling a little bit, and sometimes she laughs. It's like you can't count on a response from her, which is just like super healthy, right? But it's not like you stand there and you demand her to give you the response that you want. You're like, okay, you're doing your thing. It's okay for you to be into your string right now. You don't have to be into me and my project at the moment, right? But if I have time to sit down with you, you know, maybe I'm gonna like see what you're doing and try doing it too, and it's gonna turn out to be really fun. I'm not gonna know what's going on in your head, but there's ways in which we can share these moments. And it goes the other way too. She loves being in a circle of people who are talking. She's really into the tonality of voices, but does she understand the conversation? Who knows? Do I fully understand the conversation? Who knows? There is that sort of just basic embodied level of togetherness that I think is always part of ethnography, but we write it out. And in part, we write it out because ethnography has long been ethically dodgy business, right? And this is something that really, I've thought about a lot in writing this book. Millie did not give me permission to write this book. And there is something particularly, you know, problematic, icky about instrumentalizing your relationship with your own daughter. I'm like fully aware of that, right? And it is it's sort of the model of ethnography in so many places, right? That you can't do it without that kind of embodied vulnerability. And yet it's how people build careers, So like, how do you come to live with that? And I mean, I think in a sense, just again, some of the changes I'm seeing in the discipline are really important along those lines to really think about what is the cost? What does it mean to do ethnography? What does it mean to think about it in terms of not documenting the truth about other people, but their impact on you and the kind of ways in which you're pulled in and made vulnerable, but also made obligated, right? So. Yeah, I think everything you're saying is really fascinating, and I'd love to take your course,
Please come take it. Please teach it.
Yeah.
But I just think it's really, I think it poses a problem, like a good problem to have, which is also we do ethnography on the assumption of a certain kind of pattern, or we're going to recognize a pattern.
Yes.
And I think in reading your book, it totally like, I mean, like I'm telling you, it kind of put a lot of things into crisis for me, which is like, what if there is no pattern except there isn't a pattern, right?
Yeah.
What does that make of ethnography? And I think that
Right.
that's so useful, particularly right now. Like we're in so many forms of chaos that chaos itself might just be the pattern.
Yeah.
Right? And so I was reading this book as like, well, what if mystery is just the pattern? What if that is the only
Yeah.
pattern we have to follow? Right? Like, what if that's the only thing that's going to get us to saturation or whatever it is, whatever the
Yeah.
language is
Right.
these days, right?
Right. Right.
But
Right.
what I mean, maybe this, I know we've got questions, so we'll shift to questions, but it left me thinking about as someone who teaches methods to grad students,
Yeah.
how do I teach them that it is okay to just be with whatever is ungovernable? Like you may not have it may not look like I did all of these interviews, spent all these years in the field, and I saw these repetition over and over again. What if you don't have that?
Right.
Well,
But
if
I think from your book, I hear, and that's still worth exploring. Like that in itself
Right.
is still worth exploring.
Right.
if I could just jump in on that point very quickly, there are different forms of ungovernable experience that are also the texture of our relational lives with others. Care is also ungovernable. Love is also ungovernable. And love is another pattern, and care is another pattern.
Mhm.
And I almost begin to feel like part of what the book is suggesting in the way that it takes us through this relationship, you say at a certain point, you can't force strangers to look at your disabled daughter with love. You can only model how it's
Mhm.
done.
Mhm. Mhm.
And there's the love of Millie and the love of a daughter, but there's also the love of difference.
Yeah.
And
Right.
it's the love of difference that
Right.
comes
Right.
through here. And maybe that's another through line here. Just thinking
Right.
with Ashanté, with the challenge that Ashanté was putting forward,
Yeah.
that it isn't, maybe it's not just the desire to classify and codify and categorize and all that, but there's actually something that we feel that carries us through this work,
Right.
which is
Right.
the love of difference.
Right. And difference is a force in the world, you know? Like we're reaching across difference with humility, right? You know, and that patterns emerge and dissipate in relationship to those moments of reaching, right? Yeah.
I really hate to jump in because the conversation's been so fun to listen to. Thank you all. But I do want to make sure we have a little time for Q&A, and folks who are following along, please add your questions. And I a lot of what I was thinking about has already been said, but I want to thank you again, Danilyn, for this beautiful book. Um, I really was moved right down, not just the prologue as a longtime Hyde Parker, the monk parakeets, of course, grabbed me right away. I think anyone who lives in that neighborhood has some experience, but the epilogue. Millie's life matters. You say it so beautifully with this very, and those who haven't gotten to the epilogue, this beautiful, simple story. You're getting a lift to the airport back in Chicago after years away, and the Lyft driver remembers Millie. Millie's life matters. It's just so beautifully done from the beginning to the end. This is a beautifully written book. My job now is to help us get to some other questions. So I see a few here. I'll start with the first one from Hugh Gusterson, if I may. And please jump
Okay.
in,
Oh
folks, if
yeah,
you.
sure. He's asking
Uh,
you. Yeah. Oh, go
yeah.
ahead.
So, Dan, message, a question for Danilyn from Hugh. Danilyn, usually book dust jackets have a picture of the author. Yours doesn't. And there's no picture of Millie, although I'm sure many readers wanted help picturing her. Can you say something about deciding on no pictures?
Well, Hugh, this is like clearly the designers at Duke University Press have like flummoxed you because there actually is a picture of the two of us. I'm standing holding Millie, looking down at her. My hair is over my face the way it usually is, and her face is visible looking up. And to the left is from a picture that was taken of the two of us. Which is on my website if you want to see it without the kind of, the designer stuff. But yeah, that's a really great question. One of the decisions I made in the book was actually to write in a way that visually introduced Millie with as much detail as I possibly could. And I thought about reading that passage from the book instead of the preface, just because I really like the idea of having her as a presence in the room. And there are other multiply disabled people in the book who I try to describe with the same detail. I know that when you're thinking about like describing disabled people, sometimes there's like you want to like there's an impulse to sort of turn away from that because you don't want to feed stereotypes. I feel like people have stereotypes in their head regardless, and I really tried to describe people in their singularity and specificity. And, that was really part of the challenge of writing this book is just being really super specific, detailed, and really trying to bring people into the scenes that I was talking about. So yeah, no, thanks for that. That's a good question. Yeah.
A question from Linda Hull. Does Millie have a special connection with animals?
That's a nice question. Kind of, I guess would be my answer. I had an English setter for years who had just a very attractive tail, and Millie's into string straps, fringes, and she would kind of like reach for Biak's tail. She's very, very gentle. Like when she reaches for something and gets it, she holds it very gently because she's really enjoying the feeling of it. And she has a sense of not wanting to hurt other beings, I think. So Biak would kind of let her get close to touch his tail, but then he kind of avoided a full-on, encounter with Millie because I think he was a little bit afraid. I now have, a 15-pound mini poodle who jumps on her lap all the time, and she just kind of laughs a little bit, feels the fur, jumps off. So those kinds of animals, pets, kind of. But the animals she really has a connection with are horses. She's been doing therapeutic riding since we moved to Santa Cruz. And that's really super amazing. She's now at a barn where she gets on the horse, she's sitting on the horse, and there's someone on the left side and someone on the right who's holding onto her thighs. She's upright and she's moving with the horse. She's feeling the horse movement. She's sort of sharing proprioceptively in kind of the horse's experience. And she loves it. It's super grounding. It's just been a really great thing for her to do. And I think that's the case for many disabled people. I mean, therapeutic riding and sort of relations with horses is kind of amazing. My colleague and friend Maura Finkelstein has an article about this, and it's something that she's been working on. But yeah, thanks for that question. That's a really good one.
There's a question here from Pamela Block. This is a big one. What do you think might be in store for Millie in the future?
Oh my God. Well, it depends on what's in store for all of us. When I was writing this book, there are moments in the book where I kind of like refer to the history of Nazi Germany, and I'm kind of like, oh, am I being too extreme? It's like, no, you're not being too extreme. It's like eugenic thinking in many ways never went away. And it's kind of back in a particularly vivid way in relationship to disabled people. And it comes with the sort of worship of work, which is part of like our political discourse. It's not just the Republicans, it's Clinton, the idea that you need to work to be worthy. And that's actually showing up in the whole way that Medicaid cuts are being thought about. Now, the administration claims that it's not going after people like Millie, although the president has suggested that people like Millie, because they're so expensive, should just die. Um, uh, they are going after her world, and her world consists of caregivers who make a living wage and can do this work, right? And funding that's there that keeps her out of a nursing home. The way that Medicaid works is that Medicaid is obligated to pay for nursing care, but it's not obligated to cover the cost of care in the community. In many states, you have to get on a waiting list for a waiver to be able to hire care workers to take care of your person at home. I live in California, where brave disability activists, disabled activists in the independent living movement in the 60s, 70s made it possible that this can just be taken for granted. But I really, can't take it for granted forever. Yeah, I mean, one of the issues for Millie is obviously what happens when I die, and she's 25, I'm 64, I'm not going to be around forever. I spend a lot of time thinking about that. I spend a lot of time thinking about how do we create alliances across class. I mean, I'm from a very privileged class. I'm lucky in so many ways. There are ways in which things would have to turn super duper south for Millie to be really threatened. But I don't kind of want to live in a world in which it's only privileged people like Millie who are able to survive. So I've been thinking a lot about how to develop alliances within our community that are not just about like wealthy parents coming together and making plans, but actually reach across some of those borders that really run right through Santa Cruz County. So, yeah, I appreciate that question. I am hoping that, she will continue to have the life that she has now forever, but it's going to take some work to make sure, or to whatever, that's going to take particular conditions that are in no sense, you know, certain at this point. Yeah.
We have two questions that are really comments, so I'll just read those. And I think I'll have to check if there's any more coming in. A comment from Robert Mott. This reminds me of Jason De Leon last year speaking of anthropology as an extractive field with all the ethical ambiguity that produces. Absolutely, I agree. I mean, you were talking about some of those questions in terms of ethnography.
Yeah. I think Jason's book is an amazing just exercise in ethical ambiguity and obligation and responsibility. I'm just incredibly impressed, both by the way he writes, the way he captures really specific moments within this kind of experience that he had, and just the fact that he had this experience, you know. So, yeah, I think it's something really, really important for us to think about. You know, I think it's not a matter of like there's basic research that's about generating knowledge, and then there's engaged research, which is about changing the world. I think these two things have to come together. If you talk to people who are in activist spaces develop theories of the world, right? You know, and so really kind of thinking about anthropology in just a more fully contextualized way. We are working in the world. We are people with bodies. We are encountering other people with vulnerable bodies. You know, there's an ethical charge that comes with this work. But yeah, I'm a super big admirer of the work that Jason De Leon has done in both of his books. Yeah.
Yeah. And then here's from Keisha Fikes. No question, but I wanted to name how moved I am by the infinitely disarming questions that this work inspires. So that's a great one as well. I have a
Yeah.
quick question, Danilyn. I'm curious. It seems to me the work, not just questions of ethnography and ethnographic questions that we've been talking about, but also, do you find that you're getting, in some ways, I think this poses challenges to linguistic anthropology, to linguistic
Yeah.
based work, right? I mean, it obviously does. But have you gotten a lot of feedback from linguistic anthropologists and in terms of this work?
Yeah. Yeah, no, thank you for that question. I mean, Summerson Carr is a colleague who's just been really, you know, helpful, a very good reader of my work. You know, I've kind of been back and forth with her. There's a real trend within linguistic anthropology recognizing that, you know, we need to move beyond simply kind of like verbal interaction, you know, that thinking about multimodality is really important. In particular, there's like this new generation of scholars who are just doing some interesting and radical theorizing beyond simply, you know, Charles Saunders Peirce, right? It's sort of,
Yeah.
I'm a big, big fan of Tara Edwards' work. Her book, Going Protactile, is a fantastic intervention in disability studies, but also in linguistic anthropology. She's did extended work with the deafblind community in Seattle around the emergence of a tactile language. But she talks about it not just in terms of like, this is a language, these are the semantics, et cetera. It's like, no, this is a way of getting back a world, right? You know, she talks about people who, you know, were born deaf and lose their sight over time, and what happens when you lose your sight and are depending on other people finger spelling in your hand to explain your environment. It's like you're losing a world, and protactile is a way of reclaiming the world through sensory engagements that are super non-normative, you know, but then create this kind of form of community. So, and she is totally, you know, fully fledged. She knows her stuff as a linguist, you know, but is also just really interested in these other kinds of issues. So again, I keep on coming back to Anand's comment about all of these sort of modalities of being and receptivity and kind of moving beyond sort of like all of these Cartesian assumptions that have been really built into anthropology for such a long time. I mean, I think it requires being open to different kinds of theoretical inspiration. It requires being imaginative. It requires being uncertain, being speculative, but I see some exciting things happening within linguistic anthropology so far. So yeah, none of them have beat up on me to date. So yeah, I'm hoping none of them will. I don't like being beat up on, but so far so good.
I think they need to read this book before any beating up happens, and take it seriously, honestly. We are out of time. There's one last question's just come in. Danilyn, I'm going to forward it to you because we truly are out of time. But I'll make sure to forward that by email. I've just screenshotted it. So, everyone, thank you so much. Also, one last quick comment for folks tuning in. I hope you saw that there are some links here for discount code for the book. So please grab that real quick. Everyone, Ashanté, you're next. Your book is next. So this
I'm
is such a
next. We're
wonderful
gonna do it again, friends.
Let's do it again. No pressure.
Oh,
But
so excited.
if you're interested, let's talk.
I'm totally interested. We've got to go 3 for 3.
Yeah.
Exactly. It's been such a
Well,
wonderful trio that I really thank you all.
I would love that if we could do it.
Okay,
you gotta do it.
I'll put in
You
a
guys
word
are
with
such brilliant, generous interlocutors. I'm moved. I really appreciate it. Yeah.
Really true.
Yeah.
Again, I'll put in a word with the powers that be here at SAR to see if we can host another one, because that would be one.
Great.
Meanwhile, though, thank you all, and signing off.
Okay.
Thanks,
Take
y'all.
care,
Bye.
everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Congratulations again.